as a CEO of this business. So it was me, it was my dad who came in on the board. It was our other co-founder Clayton and his whole science team, and we're just like running and gunning with no money, out there just trying to make it happen. And so like, and that was how I got into it, right? Like it was by pure accident almost.
Welcome to the Coles Ventures Podcast.
Well, thank you for being on. Busy day, a lot going on, but appreciate you being here. And yeah, if we just want to kind of start, this is actually our first ever video conference podcast I've ever done. Usually they're all been Spokane founders, local people thus far. So excited to kind of test this out and see how this goes. But yeah, if you just want to intro yourself and tell the people a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing and all that, that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, well, I would have loved to come out except for the massive flooding we've been having here getting through the pass. So would have been tough to drive through. I'd actually I was last Tuesday when we had all the warnings. I had gone out to Central Washington basically and had like three closures on
Oh,
90. It was
geez.
it was wild. It was just like puddles, like waterfalls coming down off the
Mm-hmm.
side of the mountain. Um, but just to kick things off, so my name's Jake Hoffberg, and I guess I still am CEO of Regenerative Industrial. We started the company about 2 years ago, and we'll talk a little more about it. And unfortunately, which so is the life of a startup, we hit the end of the runway after having some of our funding not materialize and some of our permitting pathways getting extended and becoming higher risk. So we decided that the best thing to do for the shareholders and the employees was to officially shut the business down, um, give people the opportunity to take the write-off on their taxes this year,
Yeah.
and many of the team members will be continuing some of the work they've been doing in some different capacities. So while it might be the end of Regenerative Industrial, it definitely is not the end of the story for a lot of the people who have been working in this space for 10 years and are continuing to work on it and are very passionate about converting biomass into carbon products and things like that. But I guess to go through the spirit of the call, I did not. I never had any plans to work in, I guess you can call it sustainability or biomass or carbon or any of those things. Um, Prior to this, I was working with a crowdfunding portal where I was, we called it the publisher since we were kind of quasi-regulated. So I wasn't a stockbroker. I didn't have a Series 7 or any kind of license. So, I didn't quote, sell stock, but we would have our customers or issuers, companies raising money, they needed someone to help them package their story, put together all their marketing materials, and help manage their campaign. And so between 2020 and 2025, I worked with about, I guess, 25 companies
Hmm.
and put together all of what we would consider your sell side marketing or your sell side analysis of what makes this an exciting opportunity and why should an investor put money into the company. And what I think was maybe the most interesting thing about that is we weren't selling, well, the people who purchased things on our website through crowdfunding, these were not institutional investors. They weren't VC or private equity. Maybe there were a couple, but these were, retail investors, many of which are unaccredited. So our minimum investment was $500 for most of our offers.
Okay.
And so what was really challenging is that you had to be able to explain what was often a very complicated industry to an investor who probably never invested in stocks before.
Yeah.
Um, and so it wasn't, enterprise software where you're talking to a VC who's, this is the 35th whatever AI for dentist company that they've looked at this month,
Yeah.
or the 15th HVAC, right? It wasn't like a
Uh-huh.
really really experienced buyer where you can come in and in 15 slides, like bop 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 bop
Right.
bop, here you
Yeah.
go, want to put a check in, and they have really easy comps. This was someone, like I said, who maybe never bought had never done like an individual stock pick in their life, right? Maybe they've invested in, ETFs or mutual funds or had a financial advisor, but this was oftentimes their very first private investment or like stock pick that they'd ever
Mhm.
done. And so the types of deals we were working on, it was like mining plays. It was a gold mine or uranium mine,
Oh,
or it was
okay.
oil and gas, or it was, medical devices, or it was pharmaceuticals, or, healthcare. It was, manufacturing. One was like a candy store. One was mobile home parks, right? So another one was HVAC actually. And so all of these things were usually had, really difficult regulatory problems, hard technical problems, hard supply chain problems, um, probably capital intensive, just like difficult things to understand, go to market
Yeah.
problems like that. And
Mhm.
so, and I'll be kind to the people, but these weren't like, S tier founders with like lots and
Right.
lots of experience, because why would they be here? They'd be
Yeah.
funded. And so I really got to get a lot of exposure to kind of all parts of the economy.
Yeah.
And if you've ever been to like an angel investing group, it's kind of funny because these are the types of deals you'll typically see there as well, right? You'll see some kind of random stuff show
Mhm.
up that just seems like bizarre, right?
Yeah.
Like why? And I love those because you get exposed to non-software companies working on really cool stuff that you never would have seen. Um, and after working on 25 of these in kind of every different industry, I really started to see a lot of connections with the way the economy worked, the way business models were functioning, how things I learned from maybe a healthcare company applied to a mining company that applied to a medical device, like all these types of weird connections of how things looked. And I really became um, a believer in the commodity super cycle, because you got to sell your own book. But this idea that for the past whatever 20-30 years, the West at least has really prioritized this idea that if you control IP and software and like the knowledge work, you have whatever the most valuable companies. And ironically, we're starting to see today, because of China's stranglehold over the upstream and midstream markets, from not just the asset bases, but like the processing, the refining, that all of these high tech plays are really actually constrained by the physical world in a way that they
Yeah.
were not before. And so, what really fascinated me about carbon, biocarbon, all this was this idea that you can make a lot of these materials from plants, right? That you could grow them, or that you could just use wasted biomass and turn that into, critical materials that you
Mhm.
could then use to support other high tech applications. And I was introduced to the my co-founder Clayton Turner about 2 years ago from a friend, a mutual friend of ours, who had known me because of my capital markets work. And I live in Tacoma, Washington, and co-founder, he lived in Olympia at the time, but wound up moving to Capitol Hill. And so he's like, "Hey, you should meet Clayton. He's local. He's got this, magic black powder thing." It's like, yeah,
Mhm.
cool, whatever, sounds great. And I'd never heard of this before, but it seemed like par for the course for the types of things I worked on. And the more and more I learned about it, the more I got into it, the more um, I guess just entranced or enthralled or enchanted, whatever you want to say, of this idea that there's all of this biomass that no one really knows what to do with. And so you have this big problem on one side, which is, here in Washington, you have all kinds of biomass. It's just everywhere. And people
Yeah.
need something to do with it because it creates fire risk. And then on the other side, you have this whole market for carbon and industrial carbon. And, most people have no clue that, carbon basically goes into everything. And maybe they've heard of something like biochar, because that's been something over the past 10 years people have talked about. And, it's a really wonderful agricultural product that, puts carbon back into the soil. And sure, there's carbon sequestration if that's your thing and it's good for the environment. But what I really became excited about was Clayton was really focused on how can we use this carbon and make it an industrial feedstock so that it could replace carbons you normally make from fossil fuels. And so these are carbons that go into things like rubbers, plastics, even high tech things like batteries and semiconductors. Carbon goes into steel. And most people don't think about this because, we hear carbon as an industrial or as like it's mostly framed as like an environmental problem, right? And not like a
Yeah, I feel
building
like,
block.
yeah, the most I've ever heard is a lot of people will, have the idea of putting it back into concrete is the one that I've heard to come
Sure,
up the
concrete,
most. It's like, yeah,
asphalt,
asphalt. Yeah.
another one. But you think about carbon fiber, right?
Yep.
Their carbon and carbon fiber. Um, it's carbon is this essential molecule that goes into, like I said, we're carbon-based life forms. Carbon is in everything around you, and it provides structure. And so I thought, what a cool idea. We could, instead of mining carbons from the ground, so whether that's natural gas, it's oil, it's coal, any of that. And a lot of that stuff, if you just look at the business case of it, okay, well, how long does it take to get a mine or an oil well or whatever, permitted? And then how expensive is it to then, build that mine? And then you have to build all the logistics infrastructure to move that product somewhere else. And
Right.
then it pulls up, you pull it up from underground and you have all of these impurities, right? Because it's
Mm-hmm.
underground. So you pull up all the heavy metals like lead, cadmium, arsenic, just all the stuff. And so now you have to purify all of those co-products, all those contaminants out of the product to put it into a usable form. And so what I thought was just so amazing is just from a pure cost perspective, if you could just, instead of having to mine all that stuff and go through all that heavy CapEx, what if you could just take, some wood or ag waste or whatever, and that's just chilling, laying on top of the earth, and you put it in some magic cooker, and then now you have a high grade, a high purity carbon, right? That'd be worth a lot of money if you could do that. And that was what we're working on, was how do you move from what is largely a low value industrial input, biochar, that has a very low market. It's a small market. Farmers don't really want to pay a lot of money for it.
Yeah.
And how can you just move that up the value chain and get yourself up to things like, so you have carbon or like carbon black, conductive carbons, or even graphite. And graphite, if people have been paying attention to batteries, is like the most critical mineral that there is when it comes to making batteries. And so that was really my journey on sort of going down the rabbit hole of carbon as a science, and like organic chemistry, for example. If you had any friends in college that, would be like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
it's like the hardest thing ever, all of that is basically carbon. It's, how carbon bonds to other molecules and makes organic
Yeah.
life. And so that was really where I got really excited, was that to me it was like, oh man, it's a semiconductor deal. It's, it's not really energy. It can be energy, but it was like all the coolest things. If you look at it, like graphene, right? Or, all these super metals or materials, in one way or another, it's like all of them can get made out of carbon. And if you could create a, a large amount of high quality carbons at a low price, you could unlock American manufacturing and American technology in a way that is just not possible today. Um, for all the reasons that we now know of, America is underinvested in its mining infrastructure and all these things. So I really saw it as a, how could you leapfrog over the China problem? Well, if you could just jump all the way to biocarbons and converting ag waste or bioindustrial manufacturing, that would be a huge opportunity.
Yeah.
And so that was really the genesis. Is from a story perspective, um, my background being a salesperson in a capital markets, like a storyteller, was like, oh, the story's so good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt really confident that there's money for this, we could go do it. And one of the things you figure out is when you move from capital markets or fundraising, and then you actually go do an operating company, you're like, damn, this is way harder than I thought.
Yeah.
And even though you expect it to be hard, you're like, damn, this is like real hard.
Yeah.
And when we had started the business, it was in 2024, so we still had Biden era
Mm-hmm.
IRA funding. The landscape for all of this was just different.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that it's still not a good idea. But when we'd started, it just like everything changed. The election happened, and any kind of funding you were looking at just got put on pause
Yeah.
from basically November to April when we had the, what was it called? The Liberation Day tariffs, whatever that was. But April
Yep.
2nd rolled around, and
Yep.
like you had it all roll out. And then the one big beautiful bill, and then AI just sort of sucking out all the money from kind of
Right.
anything that's going on. So that is the unfortunate reality of building businesses. Is you need capital to make investments to build things, and unlike a software company where you can pretty quickly get to revenue and
Mm-hmm.
start having customers, when you're running an operating business or a mining company or a manufacturing facility, um, it's you really can't generate revenue subscale. I
Yeah.
mean, you can, but like it's not significant enough where you can say, cool, we're running one of these machines, right, and making some stuff small scale, to now I got to jump to, but this customer, in order to buy it from us, we need to be generating 100 times that per month that's going on. And so that gap, that valley of death, um, that winds up being the place that's difficult. And so, as you probably know, getting all the off takes lined up, getting the products lined up, getting the funding lined up, it feels really simple on a slide deck and in a business
Yeah.
plan.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, when one of your counterparties is a government entity, or it's
Yeah.
it's a county, and they decide the
Mm-hmm.
fate of your permits, even things that feel like a sure thing that you have been told are going to happen, that stuff can change
Yeah.
for no reason at all, outside of your control. Um, and so, I'll stop there. But that was how I got into the bioeconomy. Was I started from doing other really non-software related stuff, and I thought this was cool, and I went for it.
That's awesome. I love that. And I'm so glad. I mean, I'm not glad that your company went under. Let me clarify that before I go on with this next comment. But I feel like, any other guest I've had on the podcast thus far has talked about the process of, they've had previous failures, or, they're going through tough times. But to have somebody like literally the same day that you decided to close the doors come on the podcast is absolutely incredible. So thank you for still doing this podcast and coming on and sharing your story. But
You're
I
welcome.
think it's incredibly important for people to know and to see this side of it, of like, it's not all funding just comes out of nowhere. Grants are easy to get. People are getting customers left and right, because I think you can definitely get on that side of LinkedIn, Twitter, what have you, where it looks like everyone is just absolutely killing it. And so to have this kind of punch in the face realism, I think is incredibly important. But I guess the next follow-up question would be, I mean, you went from, like you said, sales role, in fundraising, capital markets, all that, to then now going into a completely different energy and sustainability focused enterprise career. How was there any like classes that you took, things you read? I mean, how did you get like up to scale, up to speed on what was going on in that realm coming from the capital market side?
Sure. So if you start from what I guess my real skill set would be, it would be I'm a good analyst, and I've got a career in sales, but in capital markets, when you're putting together stories, really what you're doing is you have to be able to learn about something you've never done before, you've never seen before, do a lot of research, and then connect a bunch of random dots and pull it together into a clean narrative where you can explain to someone, hey, here's why you should give us money. And, here's what's going on in the industry, why previous companies have failed, why is this hard? What other people are trying, why that's not going to work, like why you shouldn't give those people money, right?
Yeah.
And what we're doing different, why our team is the team. Like there's a lot of this explaining you have to do.
Yeah.
And for better or for worse, when I was in my previous role, we never did it wasn't like I got to go work at JP Morgan and go through an analyst program and like all I
Yeah.
did was X, one sector, and I just did that for like 5 years and knew everything about this one part of the market, right? I had to constantly go into new sectors because whatever our clients showed up with, like that's what they had, right? And
Yeah.
so we weren't in a position where we could really heavily specialize, so we had to be a generalist platform. And a lot of what that meant is you're kind of at the mercy of what's hot right now, and you kind of have this like, hey, what's like a good deal? And then what do we think we can sell to investors? And you have this Venn diagram, and that Venn diagram is pretty small. And a lot of times what happens when you're a small boutique firm is you're oftentimes out of cycle, right? So you've
Yes.
got these what look like really good plays, but either we're out of cycle because it was hot 5 years ago and you're kind of over the hump, and now you're in like no one wants to touch us anymore, but you've got a thesis that like, hey, 2 years from now the market's going to move back, and we just need to fund the business through the transition, and it'll be a hot business 2 years from now when the cycle returns. And that takes a lot of conviction, right, in what you're doing. That because if you're in startups, right, if you're investing in something that's hot right now, you've already missed it, right? Like you have to be ahead of the curve. At least if you want to invest in early stage, right? If you're investing in later stages, sure, it can be hot, but like if the AI thing is happening, right, and you're here now and you're now investing in AI startups, like you're too late, right? And so how did I get into it? So it started out as I was going to help Clayton raise money for his idea, and the reason I felt confident I could do that is it was the magic black powder deal. So hey, it's just some commodity thing. And like every commodity company in some way, it's a magic white powder, or it's a black liquid or something, like
Right.
it's a thing.
Right.
And there's always something that it does that's magical. And so I just started doing a lot of research. One of the things that I started with, typically what I start with is going to be government research, right? Because there's always some Department of Energy or whatever. There's some person who toils away at some desk, over in
Yeah.
one of those departments, or some consulting firm who's put together like some 300-page report for the DOE on this weird niche subject. And so, I just read a lot of those. And in 2013, the Department of Energy, through one of their divisions, can't remember which one, has this thing, beta. So I can't remember what that stands for either. It's like something Energy Technologies Office.
Mhm.
And they had this thing called the Billion Ton Report that they started in 2013. And the Billion Ton Report was essentially the DOE saying, hey, we have every year about 1 billion tons of sustainable excess just biomass, from forest residues to ag residues, just all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And they're like, yo, America, we should do something with this stuff. And this is where the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Grand Challenge came out of, and a lot of other stuff came from, hey, like we have all this supply, like what could we do with this supply?
Yeah.
And so most people in biomass are really focused, in my opinion, on the wrong things. is they're focused on energy, right?
Yeah.
So they're going after like liquid fuels or burning it for fuel. And we can talk about the history of this if you want.
Yeah.
But when I was looking at all these businesses of like why do these businesses suck? It's like you want to know who the worst person to compete against in the world? Scaled up oil and gas,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Big
Like
oil does not like to play nice.
yeah, and this idea that, even sustainable aviation fuel, which, they've been working on that since basically after the oil embargo in the 70s, right? The US Navy back in the 80s was actually the buyer of first interest that said, "Hey, we need a different, like if we don't have oil, right, and Iran cuts us off, we just need it at any price." And so they really started the push for researching how can we have an alternative to jet fuel to make from biomass. And then that's why Washington State really became the epicenter of a lot of this research, was because we have, naval-based Kitsap,
Right.
JBLM, and a bunch of our, Western naval bases out here. And then Alaska Airlines came in and said, "Hey, this sounds really cool. We'll hop in on this train." University of Washington, Wazoo, each got like $40 million back in like the early 2000s. But like a lot of it here in the state of Washington, we just had all this excess biomass from sawmills and they just needed to get rid of it. So it used to be that they just burned it, right? It was
Yeah.
literally just light on fire, right? And then like in the late 60s, I think it was like 1967, Washington State was the first state to pass the Clean Air Act. So we didn't have a federal Clean Air Act, but Washington State passed it,
Hmm.
and they're like, "You got to stop burning this stuff." That's basically it. So all the sawmills and paper mills are like, "Okay, well now that we can't just open burn it, we have to basically convert that into electricity." So now they
Mm-hmm.
had like hog fuel burners. So then that's how that got started,
Hmm.
and then it got turned into liquid fuel. So like this is where it came from, was it was a disposal problem, right? So we're like, we just got to
Yeah.
get rid of this stuff.
Yeah. And to
It
an
wasn't
extent, I
until
mean, it kind of still is.
it definitely still is, and this is
Yeah.
why you have like why sustainable aviation fuel or hydrogen projects, even though they don't really pencil, like sustainable aviation fuel is still whatever 3, 4, 5, 6 times more expensive than
Yeah.
jet fuel. But it's like, but hey, we got all this stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
if we don't deal with it, like the forest light on fire, and like that's a big problem. Um, but like logistically speaking, moving all that biomass is really really hard, and there's just no money in kilowatt hours. Right? Like
Yeah.
you just can't make money selling kilowatt hours, and you can't make money selling fuels, and it's a horrible mess to permit, right? And despite the Washington, Oregon saying that they want it, no one actually does. I mean, you look at the refineries that got shut down, right? Like we had huge opposition from BP and Phil. I think it might have been Conoco or BP or something, but like all the stuff on the West Coast, aside from I think California, like no one wanted it. They do not want the oil companies, who are the only people who are cashed up to do that. They did not want them to get any bigger.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
weird. Um, and so we saw these business models keep failing because you're like, hey, we're gonna burn it for energy, and then we're gonna get carbon credits somehow, and then we're gonna wind up with this biochar, and like, cool, we have that too. But you look at the economics, and it's so exposed to volatility. From if oil prices are high, it makes great sense. But when you
Yeah.
have you're selling energy, and unless you have battery storage or you're using it on site immediately, like getting an interconnect very hard, takes a long time. Carbon credits are kind of at the whim of that market over there. And then biochar, which small market that no one really wants to pay for. Like how do you turn that into a business?
Yeah.
And so we saw that really as the critical weakness, which is, well, what if you can make products out of that instead? So what if you could take the byproducts and actually make something more useful? And this leads us to industrial carbons. So most systems are usually gasification systems, which means they're burning everything, and all the liquids that come out of the wood, they just burn that because they don't know what to do with it. And one of the things that we figured out is the liquids, the oils, actually, if you refine them, wind up being your highest value products.
Hmm.
But it takes so many disciplines to run that business, because you have to be good at biomass and processing and making carbon, and then you have to basically know how to do chemical engineering. And then now you have this issue of you have all these offtakes that get these products that get made and they go into different markets. And so now you're managing, like, you got, hey, you have this one feedstock that comes in, this portfolio of products that now you have to make, and then those have to go into different markets to different customers at different
Mm-hmm.
times. So you can see why this, like, you start to get into these problems of to really make it work, you need to organize like a large supply chain to mobilize all of these resources.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get stuck, right? Without, infinite money, if you can't monetize all of it and get everything going on, it's just really, really difficult to make those things work. So how I got into it was from this idea of we had started out with the carbon was going to go into plastic
Okay.
and black plastic. So you take black powder and you put it into black PET injection molding, and now you have
Yep.
carbon reinforced polymers, and so you have like plastics that are super groovy. And we were able to successfully do that. And
Okay.
and the issue with that becomes, okay, but in order to get that thing going, we need to get scale, right? We
Right.
need a large enough amount of scale, because there's no buyer that's like, cool, thanks for like 10 pounds of this, but we need like a couple million pounds of this
Right.
to like put it into our system so that we can sell it to our customers, because our customers
Mm-hmm.
aren't going to buy your cool sustainable plastic thing, batch load at a time, right? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. But they're like, okay, but if we do that, now we wind up with like, gallons and gallons of this oil. So like, well, what do
Right.
we do with the oils?
Yeah.
Um, and so then we figured out that, okay, well, if you split the oil, you can pull the water out and you get this tar product. So basically, it's like creosote, or it's wood tar. And we figured out, cool. Well, it turns out that tar product is a really, really great industrial sealer. And it's
Okay.
just, and we had a lot of interest from maritime companies who needed something that was lower toxicity than a lot
Great.
of like the petroleum products that they're putting
Yeah.
on boats, and all the stuff that's water adjacent and salmon adjacent. And so
Yep.
they really were excited about this idea that they could have a lower VOC, whatever lower toxicity thing that was renewable and sustainable and worked really well. And then you had this vinegar product, wood vinegar, or pyroligneous acid, and it turns out that it has this chemical called carrageenan. And so after a forest fire, I don't know if you know this, but stuff grows like really, really fast. And the
Right.
reason is because carrageenans send a signal to plants that say you should grow super fast because you need to compete for sunlight. And
Oh, that makes
so
sense. Yeah.
yeah, and so what winds up happening is the wood vinegar, depending on how you dilute it, it's amazing because it's a biostimulant, so it makes plants grow faster. It's a natural fungicide and pesticide because that's how plants protect themselves, right? It's like the vinegars in there.
Right.
Um, and so we used it as a chemical. We have apple trees on our farm, and so we used it to manage like codling moss. It was great. And then if you add some other things, you can neutralize the pH and turn it into like calcium acetate or magnesium acetate or potassium acetate. So a lot of these chemical inputs that farmers would use, now they could have a completely organic replacement for synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, for all these inputs that they normally use. And so we were starting to get some traction with farmers in Washington on, cool. Now you have these inputs that you can use. So, long story short, there's all these really, really amazing products. And why we thought the business was going to work is, if you look at oil and gas, they make revenue from liquid fuels, but they make almost no profit.
Yeah.
They make like 1%, 2%. It's very, very small. But where they make all their money is on their chemicals, right? It's turning oil into plastic, right?
Mhm.
Into rubbers, into pharmaceuticals, into, all these high-end products. And so we're like, okay, if we could compete against the oil and gas IP in these high margin chemical products, there's enough margin in there that we can make it work. and there's enough demand from people to replace those oil, to replace those chemicals that, we could get somewhere meaningful that didn't stick us into, it's just farmers, it's super
Right.
seasonal, has,
Yeah.
infinite long adoption cycles because it's like, the perpetual science project that goes on. Um, and so, that was really where we came from, was how can we turn this into an industrial business with, large scale offtakes, because, we can make a standardized chemical product. And then we saw, hey, you flip it on its head. If you can sell all the chemicals, you could basically just give away biochar,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because now your economics are, by volume, by weight, by density, the chemicals are your, if you're going to ship anything, right, move the chemicals,
Right.
and you could just kind of like give the biochar away to farm, whatever, sell it for something, and just take the carbon credits for that, and you'd be, plus money on that side. So probably a long way of answering a short question, but all of these things were what fascinated me about when you look at mining plays. None of these companies that are any good, let's say it's a gold mine or a silver mine or whatever, or a copper mine, right? They don't just get one thing out of the ground,
Right.
right? They get a bunch of other stuff too. And the way that those companies become successful is that they get a lot better at monetizing the co-products that come out. And you can see now there's a lot of companies that are investing in, going back through old mining tailings, stuff that was trash products that happen to have all these critical minerals in them, and you're turning those into it. And so that was really our whole thesis, was, how can we do a better job of recovering more value out of the biomass, instead of like, hey, just burn it and get rid of it, right? So that's that, and I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great. I think you, I mean, that's so much information that honestly had no idea. So that's super helpful. But how did you go from, okay, I'm going to help out this, random guy that I got connected with, friend of a friend. I'm going to help him fundraise for this thing he's working on, to then, leading the company. How did that kind of progression play out?
So, like many good stories, you're probably a series of dumb, looking back, I don't regret any of it, but, like a series of of dumb decisions that, lead you down, or like, why did you do that? I don't know. It seemed cool at the time,
Yeah.
right? It's not like I didn't go to college for chemical engineering. I went to college for music. Like I didn't have any business being involved with any of this, other than that I thought it was cool. Um, but I was working with the guy again. He was local, became friends, and it was going nowhere. And he was working with sort of a bunch of other people because he was trying to get this thing funded. This is his, dream he's been working on for 10 years.
Jeez.
And all of a sudden, I think this was like I'm in June, July of last year. Basically, one of these projects all of a sudden got some traction, and it was a project in Colorado. And the guy was looking to build basically an industrial park that was going to have like solar, and going to use biomass to do energy and geothermal. And in Colorado, they've got like a bunch of beetle kill wood. They got the San Isabel forest fires. And so the idea was they were going to get basically, completely worthless wood, right? Burn it for some energy. That would, and then they would have a whole park. There's going to be EV charging stations. It was going to be this whole concept. And they had finally, after 5 years of waiting, gotten their interconnect approved with the San Isabella energy people. So like, hey, we got a live one. Cool, this thing is happening. And then I said, cool, I'll help with putting together this financing. And I'm like, I'm just going to take a fee on this. And so it started out with, this was going to be, we were just going to license the technology to someone else, sell them the equipment, get paid some engineering fees. And then, if that was all that happened, cool, get some money. But if it went well, there'd be some more money on the back end. So we got ourselves into this, and then you start to build financial models. The charts go up and to the right. You're like, oh my god, we're gonna get rich. And you start to believe this, and you start to trick yourself into thinking like, oh man, how is this gonna work? It doesn't matter. Like this, it's totally gonna work. And you kind of skip over some diligence that maybe you shouldn't
Yeah.
have. But like, it's such a cool story. Everyone's excited about it, because who's not excited about the story? it
Sure.
looks like there's financing that's going to come through. And, TLDR. So we were going to use a combination of USDA, rural financing. There's going to be some tax equity in there. It was like a really wonky capital stack that had like, it was C-PACE financing. It was USDA rural. It was going to be some tax equity. There's going to be some carbon credit. It was just like a dog's breakfast of
Yeah.
financing, which I was like, cool, right? We got all this cool stuff.
Yeah.
You put it together, the ball drops in here, you go, and like money pops
Yep.
out of the bottom.
Yep.
And it only takes like, $3.99, like whatever, nothing 99 to get started. And so it was like this magical, financial engineering project that just seemed so cool. And, whatever, I put some money into it because I needed to lock down the rights. I kicked out all these other people he was working with to clean that up. And then it was such a good idea that I sold this idea to some other people too. So now I had other project developers who also wanted to get on this gravy train. So now I had like 3 different projects all running at the same time, just like totally loosey goosey.
Yeah.
And then we're that thing winds up getting stuck. We're going into the election, and we're still not through the financing. So we started this in, I don't know, June or something. Let's call it maybe earlier, and it's June, July, August, September, and now we're like, hey guys, we are nowhere near closing this financing. We're getting this election coming up. And it's like, what's like, is this happening? Because if it doesn't happen now, we're gonna hit an election. It's not gonna happen.
Right.
So sure enough, right, we get hung over exactly what happens, which is we can't get the deal closed fast enough, and the lender gets fatigued. They say, hey, we can't get there. This is too hard. And
Yeah.
then everything rolls over, and they're like, we might not have a USDA anymore. I don't know, right? So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
whole that whole capital stack blows up. But um, expecting that all these products were going to go through, we went ahead and bought. We bought a bunch of equipment, and I think we spent like 50 grand on whatever, some kilns, some other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
because Chinese New Year was going to happen. We needed to get stuff ordered, maybe tariffs. So like all
Yep.
right, we got to get some stuff here. So we bought some stuff, and then it's like, I think it's December now, and that project's blown up. These other ones are kind of not working, but this stuff's coming, right?
Yeah.
And we're like, we have nowhere to put this. Like, it's on a boat, and it's gonna land in like 2 weeks. We have no place to store any of this. And so we start looking. I live in Tacoma, and we just start looking for places. And you just kind of travel down the highway down to Lewis County, which Centralia, Chehalis, and we found a place, rented it out, received the equipment, it showed up over there, kind of thing. And that was it. Like, and then we had a little lab. Um, and then, fast forward to February, the final one of our, baby turtles of these projects that we're trying to get financed, the last one died, and we're like, well, we got this equipment, and we're kind of like pregnant with the deal. We had, kind of money in the deal already, and we're like, okay, either we got to shut it down now and just take the loss, which, you know, seemed, it's always tough to do. You've got
Yeah.
money in, and you've gone so far, and like, well, I could just write this whole thing off, or, I could double down and put
Uh-huh.
some more, and because we really believed in it, and we're like, okay, but in order to make this work, we're gonna have to own or operate the business,
Yeah.
because it was just too hard to get someone else's project across the finish line, get the financing closed,
Yep.
and we're like, okay, so we're just gonna try to do it ourselves. And this is where I don't have any background in running an operating company like this. This is not my skill set. I'd originally thought this was going to be a licensing play, which I can do. I
Right.
came from publishing, so like the idea that we're going to make IP and license it was really, really appealing, and then
Yeah.
get royalties off the IP is like, yeah, sure,
Right.
we can. That's cool.
Easy
We'll do
peasy.
that.
Yep.
Easy peasy, right? And a lot of other businesses have this idea too, which is they want to be in the picks and shovels business. They want to sell their equipment to other project managers.
Right.
but and then they want to sell some, software overlay where they're going to get all the
Uh-huh.
data and do all the
Yep.
MRV
Yeah.
stuff. And I'm sure you've seen this. But what we
Oh
saw
yeah.
is like, okay, but if you can't prove to the people buying it that stuff works, right, and that there's a buyer for the stuff that comes off of it, you wind up in this perpetual cycle of like, they want you to make all these guarantees and promises and warranties and representations about it, and you're like, I can't do that, man. Like I can't make any of those.
Yeah.
And so the fastest way to solve any of these is like, okay, well, if we could just make some stuff, right, and then prove that there's a buyer, it would be easier for someone else to say, cool, I'll take one of those machines. And so that was what we did. It's like, we're just gonna do this. We're gonna figure it out. Wound up finding a sawmill that was local, small counterparty who, there's all kinds of wood. We were gonna co-locate it right next to the sawmill so that, the wood is like, it's all their waste wood. They just walk it right across
Yep.
the yard. It
Yep.
solves nicely all the transportation issues. It was really, really nice. And then we weren't gonna have to like go run this thing ourselves. It could be,
Yeah.
people who were in there. So that was like the working thesis from basically, April of this year till now. And we had all this stuff lined up, had the site, had local support, and we had applied for some grant funding to do a bunch of additional permitting and research. That wound up not happening, and then the permitting issues got a little wonky. But like it was one of those things of where we are today was not the thing I signed up for 2 years ago.
Right.
What I thought was like, hey, 6 months, put together this financing, I'll earn like a nice, whatever. I put some money into the deal. I'll earn a nice 3-4x that, just rip some fees back out and I'll get a piece on the back. To now I'm working 7 days a week, as a CEO of this business. So it was me, it was my dad who came in on the board. It was our other co-founder Clayton and his whole science team, and we're just like running and gunning with no money, out
Yeah.
there just trying to make it happen. And so like, and that was how I got into it, right? Like it was by pure accident almost.
Yeah. Gosh, that's awesome. What a story. What a narrative. I mean, I see exactly the whole thing is just like in some people's vision, obviously the outcome, not what we wanted, but along the whole lines, I mean, what an incredible journey and a story. I mean, what throughout all that, if you were to go back, maybe there's, I'm sure things you change or do different, but what is there one thing that you like you're taking away from this as like, this was, even though it didn't end up going how you wanted it, was like a impactful moment in your life?
Oh, I mean, getting to the best part about this, despite, losing a bunch of money, was working with my dad.
Yeah.
So my dad lives on Vashon Island. He's retired a couple times, and he wound up. I put a bunch of money in, and my family put a bunch of money in, and so getting to work with my dad basically every day and talk to him all the time was easily the best part of this. And despite all the sadness of shutting down, he said the same thing of like, hey, if what else am I going to do with the money besides, take care of my family? And so, if you told me that, this is my last year to live and I was going to, spend the money and get to hang out with you every day, like I'd write that check again in a second.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Had we, the irony of it is if we had known what we know now back then, like any entrepreneur, probably we never would have done this. So like, nah, man, that's way too crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But had we sort of committed to a different business plan a lot sooner,
Yeah.
and then also been willing to have put in the same amount of financing, which we would not have been willing to do, right?
Yeah.
It probably like we would just move faster, right? We probably could have
Yeah.
gone through some things sooner.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, it would have, there's a lot of decisions that would have been like if you had just decided to do the owner operated thing first a lot earlier, you could, maybe we could have gone through in 2024 getting the first project financed with the magical capital stack while it was still there, and then
Yep.
been cashed up for 2025, right, to move forward. Um, Otherwise, I think like inevitably, had we had some other cash flowing business that we could have bolted this onto, that obviously that would have been preferred. But even if I had known that, what would I have acquired? right?
Yeah.
What would have been the initial business that I would have been able to go out and buy? Same thing, like whatever it was, it'd be like, I have no business buying that one, right? And so, cool, I'm gonna go buy like a sawmill. Like, no, why would I do that? Like, that's why would I ever do that? Or I'm gonna go buy, a chemical company. Like, what do I know about that? Zero, right? So, um, so I think again, had we just committed to, based on the money we'd spent, just buying some different equipment sooner and getting down a specific R&D track faster, I think it could have worked better. But it didn't work out that way. It just didn't. Um, and so is life, and so is capital markets, and who knows, maybe a year from now or 6 months from now or whatever, the market will be like, oh my God, this is super hot. We need one of these things,
Hmm.
and we'll roll this back up and spin it up, and someone will have some money for it. But as of right now, Washington State is a difficult place to do business. And I don't think I'd want to move to somewhere else to go do it. So that also becomes a challenge when you're like, oh, cool, you can go move to Louisiana and do this. Like, no,
Right.
not doing that, right? Or
Yeah.
wherever, some place.
Right.
Um, we really wanted to, be in Western Washington,
Right.
help solve a big problem in Western Washington, which is a lot of this biomass. And, what do you do with forestry? How can you help with dairy farmers or apple farmers, these orchards? It was a really cool story that seemed like it would be a really, really great Washington story. Um, but uh, but it didn't work out.
Yeah. And what makes Washington such a, because people usually tote California as like the hardest place to do business, just don't ever think about doing business in
Well,
California. But
sure.
I mean, Washington's up there. What specifically about those two states make it difficult to start a business, operate a business, do all of that?
the What's interesting about the West Coast, whether Washington, Oregon, California, is from a political perspective, the sensibility is very aligned towards a business like this, right? People want something like this to happen.
Right.
And that's not to say that, Idaho or Texas or, Florida or wherever, don't care about the environment. I mean, they do, but they don't have a built-in like, hey, sustainability or climate is a thing that we care about already. They're like, yeah, that's great, but we don't have money for that thing that you're talking about. We have money for other stuff that, we could have you do. So with, you have the Climate Commitment Act, and you have these funding mechanisms, Microsoft's here with the money cannon for carbon credits, Amazon's here. So that there's a lot of counterparties who potentially would be really good who would be good funding sources if you
Right.
can do XYZ. And unfortunately, the XYZ thing is get permits to build your
Ah,
thing. And when you look at the big difference from a software company to anything in the real world, when you're investing in software, you just don't have to deal with any of that stuff. Right? You,
yeah.
you don't have this issue of, hey, or if you build real estate, you're familiar. Hey, if you want to build housing or wherever, in California, I mean, you're talking like it's going to take you 2 years just to get a permit, if that, before you could ever put a shovel in the ground. And so if you're raising money to start that project and you're like, cool, it's going to be 2 years before we even put a shovel at best. Well, if anything happens in the middle and it gets extended or delayed, well, now all of your returns, whatever you modeled out, is wrong, right?
Right.
And so this sort of has the same thing, which is it's a great place to do business and it's a worse place to do business because getting permits is so difficult to build anything, right? And I had told people throughout the fundraising process, they asked all these questions about technology and competition and whatever, and I'm like, no, like you don't understand, right? Like the moat is permitting, right? Like it's like I don't think you understand how impossible it is to build anything in the state of Washington and get permits. And if we can, and I told this that like the real path dependency is not will someone buy what we make, right? That's actually, well, that is a challenge. You still have to do that. Like that's
Right.
actually
Yeah.
not the hard part,
Yeah.
right? The hard part is, can you get a facility permitted so that you can make the stuff so that people will give you an offtake contract because this is the chicken or the egg, which is, hey, we would love to buy your carbon credits, or we'd love to buy your bio, or we'd love to buy any of these things from you, but like, when can we expect delivery for this stuff, right? And they need to know the answer to that question. Otherwise, like, how do they line up a purchase order, or like, how do they do that? And so if you have no certainty on when is this permitting going to happen, well, then you don't really have, like, sure, I can get an LOI that says, yeah, if one day you can make this, and sure, I could have done that, but like, those things have no teeth, right? Those are not binding purchase orders that I can go to a bank and say, hey, I've got an order for this much stuff and I need some money from the bank to like go build this thing. Right. And so that was really the chicken or the egg, is the difficulty of, getting a site, getting we had to get air permits. You have to wind up getting, so a whole host of environmental permits, and then the county's got to get on there, and then college, like, everyone kind of wants their pound of flesh
Yeah.
in the process. But once you get something up and running, right, you have it installed, right, you have a permitted location that's doing that thing, that asset is pretty valuable at that point, because now you're like supply and demand, right? There's only so many places that are permitted to make these carbon credit type projects or make these things, and even less that are at any kind of scale. If you can crack that, now you have like the open shot of, we're the only person that's making it. It's relatively easy to sell those.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes these things difficult. But our whole idea was, if we could get through the permitting process and get a prior work of art, why would someone want to buy a different technology? Right? Why wouldn't you just say, hey, you guys managed to get this thing permitted in like the hardest possible place in the world to get it permitted, and you figured out all these other things to make this thing compliant. We'll just take that.
Yeah.
Right? And we'll just license that tech. And now your scaling is relatively easier, because you solve the biggest risk for someone who wants to buy your technology. And when you look at like mobile units, I was like, how do you get any of those things permitted, right? Because it's so different from jurisdiction by jurisdiction. You got to drag it up there. Some people will let you, some people won't. Some people, you got to
Yeah.
cite it. Um, and we just felt like if we could solve that problem, and some buyer could say, hey, we spent X dollars on this thing, it takes, Y months to get this thing permitted pretty consistently, and it's going to make Z money every year. Well, now you move from this really, really high risk, speculative kind of, like, same thing with like it's like building a piece of commercial real estate with no tenants, right?
Yeah.
You build it and you're like, who's the tenants? No idea. Like, okay, that's super, super risky. But once you build the format one time, you stack up the building and you get it cash flowing. Now everything else after that is not super high risk equity anymore. It's just traditional project finance. And that was really felt like, our seed round was, can we prove that this can actually get stood up? And then we could say, cool, we could take in 10, 20, $50 million now, and feel confident that we could deploy that capital and actually get a return on that, versus, um, some other companies that I won't name, where, they wind up with 20, 50, $100 million in kind of total money thrown in there, and they have like, zero products produced. Why? Can't get a site up, can't get permitted.
Dang, permitting. Who would have thought? But those paperwork in the end.
If you work in mining, though, or you work in real estate, that is it, right?
Yeah.
So if that's
Yeah.
your framework of getting a mine, imagine what it would take to get a coal mine permitted in the state of Washington. It'd be impossible.
Yeah.
Right? Or imagine what it would take to get a new sawmill or a new paper and pulp mill permitted. Never happen, right? Look at trying to build. We haven't built a refinery in America since like the 70s. Why? You can't get it permitted, right? Because of the environmentalists, right? And so you have this thing of like, if you work in any kind of manufacturing or materials or things, like, that like your biggest cost overrun is always, it deals with, can you actually build this thing and get it permitted and not get stuffed? Or NIMBYism or whatever that delays your project for 10 years, which is like the story of nuclear. But most investors, when they look at these types of businesses, they ask things that are like tech questions. They always ask, who's the competition? What about your IP? Right, dude, none of that matters. None of that
Yeah.
matters at all.
Oh my gosh, that's so killer. Yeah, I had no idea. God. So what now? Well, I mean, I'm sure you've been thinking about that question a lot today, but what do you think? You know, take it easy for a while, figure out what you're gonna do, what the next step is, or do you have a pretty good idea of what you're gonna go out and do?
Well, so, in the meantime, I'll probably pick up some, client work and, work with some
Sure.
other companies and do some writing and, and do that. Um, who knows? Maybe fate will spin the wheel and, some random person will show up with some $10 million and say, "Hey, we love this thing. Like, why don't we do it?"
Yeah.
That's how things are working. Those are always fun things, but,
Yeah.
um, yeah, our team, our science team, they're already working. So there's some people up in Canada that are doing, projects like this. We've had some other waste to value companies we've talked to that are doing like textile recycling. Same issue, right? It's their biggest issue is you have people who have this great story about recycling, but they don't know the first thing about importing equipment. They don't know the first thing about building stuff. They don't know anything about like they don't know how to do any of those things. So I think, like all, I guess this will be a tongue in cheek, like all failed entrepreneurs, your life as a consultant comes next, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
get to go work with other businesses. Um, but I'm looking forward to whatever that is, and I know that I'll still be able to do good things from what I used to do, right? Working with companies to help tell the story, sell their products, do investor relations, and at some point I'll find my next thing.
That's awesome. Well, I think where got anything else to add before we wrap up? Where can people find you, reach out to you? Any words of wisdom before we pop off here?
So I think LinkedIn is always the easy way to find me, since whatever email I'm using at that time, it'll be connected
Yeah.
to that. Otherwise, I don't know if I have words of wisdom other than entrepreneurship is hard, but and most of them fail. But if you're someone who invests in early stage companies, these are the types of companies that need to get funded, and we really should encourage people to work on these hard problems because long term, these are the things that are going to make a difference for not just Washington, but for the United States. And so, I think that there's a whole generation of people who really are looking for a pathway into whether it's sustainability or entrepreneurship or climate or whatever, and they don't see them or no one ever told them that you could do all those things in manufacturing, right? You could do those things in a business that isn't necessarily policy work per se, although that is important. But there's so many things you can do with existing companies that involve things like supply chain, sourcing materials, raising capital, working with stakeholders. There's so many ways that you can make a difference in the physical world that makes blue collar jobs. And not enough people have been exposed to that idea that that's a worthwhile thing to do. They're going to go chase whatever, like AI for dentists or something, and it's going to be something that sure maybe you'll make some money on that, but like, are you going to really look back on that period of your life and be like, man, I really went for it and solved the calendar booking problem for dental assistants, you know, or did you work on something that you can be really proud of, win, lose, or draw? That hey, I did something, I went for it, and you know, and that would be my word of wisdom: is if you're gonna do something and work really hard, at least do something that will make a difference if you succeed.
I love it. That's awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again for coming on, sharing your story, and I look forward to seeing whatever you end up doing next.
Thanks, Blake.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake.